Hello, welcome to another episode of Harlem Stories. This is Adam Feinberg, your host of the podcast, and we hope to bring you some exciting and interesting content. Today, we're doing something a little bit different, and we're including, all of New York City today. But of course, as always, there is always a focus at a bare minimum on Upper Manhattan. Today, we're going to talk about something a little different than most people are accustomed to from us, but certainly part of New York City history and certainly an interesting aspect to it. Before I get into our topic for today, I want to remind you that this is a bi-weekly podcast, and we love to bring in great content. We used to run it weekly, but ultimately, considering that this is, just one of those things that I do to help educate and, hopefully inform, but also entertain the public. This is actually a side gig for me, and there's no compensation, but, I enjoy doing this. So hopefully, this can, help entertain and educate. So today we're going to talk about superheroes and their creators that have called New York City home. So very, very different than normal. In today's episode, we're going to approach this a little different, and in more than a couple episodes, we have touched on other areas of Manhattan or even Manhattan in general. And we're still going to discuss Upper Manhattan, of course, but we will likely talk about Manhattan in general or New York City as a whole quite a bit often more than we normally do. So when we talk about superheroes, why are so many of the characters and storylines related to New York City? Well, I can speak firsthand to this, but pretty much anyone that has any sense of U.S. history knows that so much of our history dates back to the northeast of the nation, with our bigger cities playing a huge role in our development, including Boston, New York, Philly, Washington, D.C., but New York City stands out as our largest and most diverse city. It's also the center of creativity, the arts, culture, marketing, but also finance and world-class architecture, museums, and so much more. Obviously, that's what attracted me to this city, and that's so much more. It's so difficult to define, but there's so many things here. So it'd be no surprise that so many artists and creatives in the comic book world lived in New York City or nearby. This is just a small peek into this world, and the conversation can be expanded considerably. We don't want to lose too much focus, so we aren't going to cover the full history and how New York City intertwines with the comic book industry. We're going to give you just a little bit of a peek, just go into that just ever so slightly. But the early days of the comic book industry, the oldest comic book known is The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck, published in Europe in 1837. And it was originally published in several different languages, but not printed in English until 4 years later. The year after that, the UK version was reprinted in New York. And for many years following, comics were mostly in the form of short strips in newspapers. And, I remember as a child, and I know this has changed now that newspapers are, rarely read in print as much anymore. But yeah, you used to, especially on Sundays where you used to get the giant version of the comics. But, anyway, going back to our story, that all changed in World War II, going away from just the short strips. And the golden age of comic books began in June 1938 with the publication of Action Comics #1, which is also the introduction of Superman. And Superman was immensely popular from the very beginning, and the industry thrived for about a decade. But the end of World War II, the sale of comic books slowed considerably, especially when you figure a lot of the stories, delved into, things of nature of the war. But that early period of comic books was known as the Golden Age, 1938 to about 1954, 1955, somewhere around there. But the next period of comic books, and this is actually what I have collected over the years, but 1956 through the early 1970s was known as the Silver Age. And most of our conversation today actually involves the Golden Age and Silver Age characters and creators. So one of the early innovators in the industry was EC Comics, or Entertaining Comics, by Bill Gaines, publisher and co-editor, along with Harvey Kurtzman, who worked on Mad Magazine. And some of our listeners that were at least in their 40s or older as of this type of recording are likely to remember Mad Magazine and EC Comics. Both Bill Gaines and Harvey Kurtzman, they're both from Brooklyn Jewish families. And that's kind of a common theme, not the Brooklyn part necessarily, but certainly at a bare minimum, the Jewish family component of it. And just came from, these are the kinds of jobs that were available for creatives back in that period. So EC Comics were best known for their line of science fiction and horror comics. So the science fiction, like stories like Weird Science, the comic books such as Tales from the Crypt. And for those of you, again, in your 40s or older, you might remember way back in the day, HBO had their miniseries, Tales from the Crypt, which is not streaming today, but I would love to see it again. But those Tales from the Crypt episodes on HBO were actually born out and basically adapted from those original stories from the 1950s. So very, very cool. I actually have, I don't have the actual comics, but I've got the reprints of those 1950s that they wound up reprinting back in the 1980s. Some really cool, fun stories and really imaginative, but great art as well. So early in Harvey Kurtzman's career, he worked for publisher Martin Goodman. So you'll wind up seeing that this was actually a pretty small industry, and you'll see Martin Goodman's name throughout for a while. But Kurtzman started creating crossword puzzles, working for Goodman, and a distant relative of Goodman was none other than the famous Stan Lee. Now, anybody that knows anything about Marvel Comics knows the name Stan Lee, and he's actually been in a lot of, actually, I think all the Marvel movies that have been released, in the last couple of decades, up until he passed. Stan offered Kurtzman. Stan offered Kurtzman to do work doing one-page fillers, and I guess Stan Lee named the strip Hey Look, and Kurtzman produced about 150 episodes of it from 1946 to 1949. DC Comics, which at that point was National Allied Publications, and then later National Comics, and later again National Periodic Publications. The DC wound up publishing was named after Detective Comics, so that's where the name DC came from. And some of the key characters here that you'll hear of is Jerry Siegel. He was the co-creator of Superman. And while him and his co-creator imagined and created Superman living in Ohio, Siegel moved to New York after World War II while working for DC Comics. Joe Shuster was also the other co-creator of Superman. He went to high school with Jerry Siegel back in Ohio, but like his fellow Superman co-creator, he also moved to New York after World War II while working for DC Comics. Another famous name in the industry, Robert Bob Kane. He was born in Manhattan as Robert Kahn, but following the success of Superman, he and his co-creator of Batman, Bill Finger, Kane had the idea of a character called Batman with some initial drawings. And Bill Finger, also the other co-creator of Batman, he grew up in the Bronx, and he was brought in to originally write scripts for Green Lantern after the character was already created. But on December 8th, 2017, the southeast corner of 192nd Street and the Grand Concourse in the Bronx was named Bill Finger Way, and the corner was chosen for its proximity to Poe Park, where Finger and Kane used to meet to discuss their Batman character. So, this all goes back to tying back and why that, New York City was central to a lot of the themes of the comic books. Another character that was involved in the early world of comic books, Sheldon Mayer. He wasn't known to the general public, but he was an artist, writer, and editor, and was one of the earliest employees of National Allied Publications, the company that would later become known as DC Comics. Oh, yeah. He was born in Harlem, too. So, again, going back to the Harlem Stories connection. Anyway, he worked on a wide variety of comics, which included All-Star Comics, which introduced the Justice Society of America for anybody that knows DC Comics. That included like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, all Green Lantern, and I think there were others, but that was the Justice Society of America. Sensation Comics, which featured Wonder Woman and weird mystery tales, weird war tales, comics that were inspired by the old EC comics. So remember, I mentioned about the importance of EC comics. Well, here it is that DC wound up, creating some different lines of comic books that were inspired by them. So we can't really talk about the comic book history, especially in New York City, without, of course, talking about Marvel. And today everyone knows them from all their movies, the million movies, from Iron Man, Hulk, and Wolverine, and all X-Men, and all these other stories. It was founded by Martin Goodman, originally called Timely Comics, and renamed as Marvel Comics in August '61. The Marvel era began with the launch of Fantastic Four and other superhero characters created by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and others. Now, Stan Lee, he was born Stanley Martin Lieber, again, another New York Jewish family. He rose through the ranks of family-run business Timely Comics, which became Marvel. He was actually born in the Bloomingdale section of the Upper West Side at West 98th and West End Avenue. I certainly consider that the Bloomingdale section of the Upper West Side to be part of our territory that we talk about for Harlem Stories. So for me, this is a pretty big win. Is that that Stan Lee was born in Bloomingdale section of the Upper West Side, but. Growing up, his dad was trained as a dress cutter and only worked sporadically after the Great Depression. And the family moved to Fort Washington Avenue in Washington Heights. By the time he was in his teens, the family wound up moving to an apartment at 1720 University Avenue in the Bronx. Stan was known as the co-creator of many of the most famous Marvel superheroes, and as Marvel movie adaptations became a major franchise, Stan had a cameo in all of them, and he stated he wanted to continue to do them until 2 days prior to his death. So obviously, this was a man that was inspired and inspirational to so many others, but he really wanted to be actively involved, even to the point of wanting to have a cameo in the movies of the characters that he helped create up until 2 days prior to his passing. So I think that's really inspiring. One of the other major characters from Marvel, Jack Kirby, born Jacob Kurtzberg, yet another New York City Jewish family, grew up in the Lower East Side. In 1940, he and writer-editor Joe Simon created the character Captain American. Sorry, my lips got dry here. It's a little dry atmosphere in here, but I'm sorry. He created the character Captain America for Timely Comics. At Marvel, Kirby co-created many of the company's major characters that we know today, including Ant-Man, Avengers, the Black Panther, Fantastic Four, the Hulk, Iron Man, the Silver Surfer, Thor, X-Men, and some others. But the common theme here is all these men came from Ashkenazi Jewish backgrounds and lived in New York City, or possibly some were born here and lived here, but all have a tie here. So now I want to kind of talk about like these settings and locations, because it wasn't just that they lived here at some point, but they kind of set the storylines just here as well, and they might have called it by various different terms or various different locations, but the ties here are significant. So for instance, the term Gotham, which is used in Batman, that's another way for saying Manhattan. The term is believed to come from the folktale The Wise Men of Gotham, a crazy little English town. Washington Irving started using the term in 1807, Washington Irving, the legend of Sleepy Hollow. And that's good timing because I'm actually recording this in October. So, Washington Irving is a big character but he began using the term Gotham back in 1807 to poke fun at New York residents by comparing them to this village where people pretended to be crazy. Today, Gotham City from the Batman comic books is basically seen as New York. So no surprise there. In Superman, you'll see reference to Metropolis, which is Manhattan. And tying back to the theme of Harlem Stories, Harlem has got its own quote unquote superhero, but actually just a really strong regular man, but Luke Cage. And for those of you that have caught the episodes or may have interest, Netflix made a series called Luke Cage based on the comic book, and it was actually filmed all throughout Upper Manhattan. So I guess on to the next one. Spider-Man, I guess, was basically originally set in Forest Hills in Queens. The Avengers headquarters was set in Midtown Manhattan. The Fantastic Four, the lab was specifically identified as a building at 42nd and Madison, so also Midtown. Let's see, 3 more characters over here that all represent Hell's Kitchen: Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Punisher, all of which have their own Netflix shows. If we want to expand on that a little further in terms of like other locations, the staircase that was used in the original Joker movie, that staircase is actually really located in the Bronx. So if you want to go visit it, the staircase that was made famous in the movie, that is really located in the Bronx. And my mom says she remembers that staircase from when she was a little girl going up and down that. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. It was actually really filmed along the 125th Street Viaduct. And for the last location, and I'm sure there's probably more out there, but X-Men Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters actually was based just outside the city in Westchester. So as far as the characters are concerned, though, we start getting into some of the ones that we mentioned: Superman and Clark Kent from Metropolis, Bruce Wayne and Batman, and Dick Grayson and Robin for obviously standing in for Gotham. Daredevil, Hell's Kitchen, Luke Cage in Harlem. The Gargoyles, who I was not familiar with, they are specifically based in Central Park North, aka 110th Street. So yet another Harlem connection. And Jessica Jones, Hell's Kitchen, Punisher, Hell's Kitchen, Captain America, Brooklyn, and I'm sure you actually, if you watch the first Captain America movie, you'll actually see the camp where he transformed into Captain was based in Brooklyn. Doctor Strange is based out of Greenwich Village on Bleecker Street. Mercedes Misty Knight, Manhattan. Iron Fist, and they ultimately wind up moving in together, living in Harlem of all places. And finally, of course, there was The Watchmen, which pretty dark film, but I thought it was amazing. They also made a mini series of it on HBO, or actually I think it's now Max, but it's still HBO to me. But in any case, this is just meant as a brief and quick introduction to you, for how Manhattan and Upper Manhattan as well, wind up tying into the comic book world, and you see some common themes here. One thing I do want to add in here is that just that theme continued at least into the late 80s, early 90s. But I can tell you, I grew up about 25 miles north of New York City in the suburbs, and we had a large enough number of nerdy guys like me that enjoyed comic books enough that we had our own comic book club, which included an annual comic book convention. And because we were just outside of New York City, quite a bit of the number of artists, from DC and Marvel were actually available. to us as part of our convention. So we actually had quite a number of the artists and writers available to us at our annual convention, and we were able to get a lot of our comic books signed as a result. So that was a pretty cool, connection there. But obviously, so much of the DC Marvel universe still resided, at least through that period, through New York City and its suburbs. So again, thank you for joining us for some interesting tales and stories of Harlem Stories. We hope that you enjoy this and continue to listen to our episodes. If you like this episode, please, on whatever your podcast app, especially Apple Podcasts, which most of our listeners are listening on, please rate and review and leave a thumbs up for us, rate us highly, and please, we really appreciate it. It allows others to discover this podcast. Thank you so much for your time, and enjoy your day.